Welcome to Maxara. Tonight's case is classified as an urban legend. Status: unverified. The following account is compiled from reported encounters, archived records, and reconstructed details. What you're about to hear is not an explanation, it's a record. This is the case of the Goatman. It was late October 1993. Two college students parked their car near a narrow bridge cutting through dense woods. They were not looking for anything unusual. The engine was off. The headlights illuminated only the edges of the road. One of them tapped twice on the dashboard as a joke, a reference to something they had heard about the local legend. 3 seconds then, the car shuddered. A single, deliberate impact had struck the rear of the vehicle. Neither student could explain it. No footprints, no dents, no marks on the paint. Only a sensation, heavy, cold, observing. They drove forward. The figure, whatever it was, did not move away. It remained behind the car, watching. Chapter 1. To understand what happened, we must first consider the setting, the soil from which this legend emerged. Prince George's County, Maryland, is not isolated wilderness. It lies on the outskirts of suburban sprawl, a place where highways and neighborhoods blend into patches of dense, old-growth forests. Here, roads narrow, trees close in, and the night becomes deeper and more silent than one might expect so close to Washington. Within this landscape, there are stretches of back road rarely traveled after dark. One local in particular took a reputation long before anyone spoke of a half-man, half-goat appearance, known locally as Crybaby Bridge. This old crossing spans a shadowed creek on what was once a quiet passage. Like many crybaby bridges across America, it carried folklore on its own, stories of sorrow, loss, and unseen presence lingering near water and woods. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the bridge and its surroundings had become a gathering point for teenagers, thrill seekers, and local youth. Some came not for scenery, but for the stories they'd been told. That strange things occurred after dark along these wooded roads. Into this environment, an even stranger narrative began to take shape. In May 1971, a University of Maryland undergraduate named George Lizama documented several versions of a local creature legend in a folklore project. His work entered the Maryland Folklife archives, setting the stage for wider public attention. Later that year, reporter Karen Hostler combed those archives and published the first known media article connecting these tales to a goat-like figure seen near Fletchertown Road, linking it to the woods near Bowie. 2 weeks later, she followed up with an even more disturbing headline about a decapitated dog found near the same area, prompting further whispers of something unusual in the county woods. As the legend spread, stories interwove with local memory and imagination. Some claimed the creature was a wild hermit, a shaggy man seen walking at night along deserted roads. Others whispered of a mad scientist from the nearby Beltsville Agricultural Research Center, whose experiment gone wrong birthed a half-man, half-goat being. The federal research facility itself would later publicly deny any such connection. By the mid-1970s, the Goatman had become more than isolated sightings. It was part of the county's living mythos. Names crawled as graffiti, phone tips to local police about sightings, and teenagers daring one another to drive down back roads after dark. In this place, where suburban lawns meet deep woods, and where the ordinary can quickly feel unfamiliar once the sun sets, the Goatman story didn't begin with tragedy, but it became tied to it. Background of people involved. The encounters associated with the Goatman legend involve an unexpectedly wide range of individuals, and not all of them were thrill seekers or paranormal enthusiasts. In the early 1970s, a group of teenage girls in Bowie experienced one of the most infamous moments attached to the legend. Their family dog disappeared after strange noises were heard outside their home near Fletcher Road. A few days later, the animal was found decapitated near the woods, and the girls claimed they had seen a large, upright figure moving in the trees that same night. There were also everyday couples, not hunters, not explorers, but people simply spending an evening together who reported unnerving encounters. Some people, or some report, describe pulling into a secluded stretch of road near Crybaby Bridge, only to hear noises in the woods that seemed too intentional to be wind or wildlife. Local youth in the 1970s and 80s even turned the legend into a dare. Some teenagers would intentionally drive down deserted back roads late at night, not to find proof, but to test the story, to prove one another wrong. One historian recalled how adolescents of that era would jokingly warn each other, "Act up too much and we'll dump you on Fletcherdown Road. The Goatman will get you." Not all reports were rooted in legend alone. In 1957, a couple in Upper Marlborough claimed to have seen a large, hairy figure near their driveway. Other periods saw claims of strange banging on cars at night, sometimes described as something or coming from a figure wielding an axe. Beyond these local tales, the legend rooted itself in community storytelling. Some residents insisted they felt watched while walking the dogs after dusk, not menaced, but observed, a detail that recurs again and again in personal testimonies and online discussions decades later. Even decades after the first printed articles, individuals on community forums describe eerie sightings along wooded roads, sometimes glimpsing a tall, shaggy figure with goat-like features, sometimes only sensing something in the shadows. What unites these accounts, whether from newspaper archives, folklorist look collections, or neighborhood stories passed down generation to generation, is not a shared narrative of violence, but of presence. Witnesses consistently recall being aware of something that seemed to observe them back without engaging directly. It was not always hostile, but it was always unsettling. Evidence and timeline. The earliest printed references to what would later be called the Goatman appear in regional newspapers in the early 1970s, long before the internet forums amplified the legend. In May of 1971, folklorist George Lizama compiled several accounts of a strange figure seen near wooded railroad crossings in Prince George County as part of a university archive project. His notes, preserved in the Maryland Folklife archives, represent some of the earliest documented mentions tied to the local lore. Shortly afterward, local press published a brief article describing sightings of what witnesses called a goat-like figure moving through tree lines near abandoned tracks. These early reports were not sensationalized. They appeared in the context of community curiosity rather than alarm. Official records from law enforcement and wildlife agencies do not document any attack, injury, or verified animal encounter connected to these sightings. However, multiple independent reports over the following decades describe similar patterns of behavior, even when details of appearance differ. Common elements reported by witnesses include knocking from wooded areas after engines shut off, cars parked along isolated stretches reported rhythmic tapping or knocking sounds emerging from dense trees line once passengers turned off their vehicles. Movement resembling vehicles, but avoiding direct illumination. Several accounts describe a dark silhouette crossing just beyond the edge of headlights, pacing alongside cars without entering the beam's brightness. Silhouettes standing upright, often partially obscured by shadows. These sightings rarely captured enough detail for a clear visual identification, yet many noted an upright, humanoid posture. A metallic scraping sounds along guardrails or wooden bridges, as if there was something heavy brushed against surfaces just out of sight. In one detailed account from 1981, a witness reported seeing a figure beneath a railroad trestle late at night. According to the description, the figure stepped forward into the faint glow of headlights, then froze, motionless, as though aware of being watched. It did not flee, it did not advance. The sightings lasted approximately 12 seconds, long enough for the witness to describe its presence, but too brief to confirm any specific physical features beyond a tall, dark shape. By 1996, the stories had grown sufficiently widespread that a local radio station hosted an open call segment inviting listeners to share encounters tied to the Goatman legend. Multiple callers recounted experiences featuring the same recurring elements: knocking, pacing, footsteps, sightings at dusk or night, even though none described the entity in exactly the same way. The consistency in behavioral reports, independent of visual specifics, suggested a pattern not exclusively tied to misidentification of wildlife or distracted perception. Instead, the investigators and folklorists noted that the common thread was behavioral response. Something seemed to interact with human presence, yet avoided direct confrontation or clear visual documentation. The disturbing discovery. In 2001, two hikers set out along a stretch of trail not far from one of the most commonly reported encounter sites, a wooded area several miles from Crybaby Bridge. They weren't searching for anything unusual. They were there for exercise, the same as countless others who had visited that forest edge over the years. Mid-morning sunlight filtered weakly through the canopy when they came upon something that stopped them cold: a deer carcass. At first glance, it appeared, in the official's assessment, to be the remains of a routine wildlife kill, partially dismembered, as if scavengers had moved in after the initial event. Coyotes, foxes, raccoons, all were known to frequent these woods. State wildlife officials who later reviewed photos of the scene concluded the condition was consistent with predation. Nothing in the formal report suggested anything out of the ordinary. But the hikers, neither biologists nor storytellers, remembered something else. Something that didn't make it into official documents. The remains were arranged upright against the tree, legs popped, antlers angled toward the sky, as if posed. There are no confirmed records verifying this detail. It exists only in retellings, accounts shared later on community forums, in internet archives, and among long-term residents who had heard the story secondhand. Yet those who repeat it insist the arrangement was deliberate, precise, purposeful. This moment, whether folkloric or factual, marked a shift in local storytelling. Before 2001, most accounts focus on sound: the tree knocks out in the woods, the scraping along guardrails, the faint rhythmic taps of the engines shut off. But after the deer incident, the entered local discussion, a new pattern emerged. Reports shifted from auditory triggers to silent observation. Sightings moved away from rhythmic knocking to a quiet sense of being watched. Witnesses began describing moments when they felt followed, not in the frantic rush of a predator pursuing prey, but in a slow, deliberate manner. They did not flee, they did not attack, they simply observed. Multiple individuals later recounted walking down wooden path at dusk and suddenly sensing something pacing behind them, not chasing, not attacking, just matching their pace. Stop, the sound stopped. Move again, the steps resume. Often no visual confirmation accompanied these sensations, only the unmistakable presence of something not human. On one such visit in 2003, a jogger described breaking into a run after hearing footsteps begin behind her. When she paused at the trailhead, her heart racing, she reported hearing 3 distinct steps stop just beyond the tree line. No figure emerged into view. No eyes caught the light, only silence. This pattern, the quiet following, the inexplicable pauses, became as much part of the Goatman lore as the earlier reports of knocking and silhouettes. And unlike the early stories that focus on auditory anomalies or distant sightings, these silent observation accounts had something deeper, a sense of awareness, as if the entity was studying the observer rather than simply existing nearby. No aggressive intent, no attack, just presence. And that lack of confrontation, the unanswered observation, made the encounters all the more disturbing. Over the decades, researchers, journalists, and folklorists have attempted to make sense of the Goatman phenomenon. Several explanations have been proposed, each addressing part of the story, but none accounting fully for the repeated behavioral patterns witnessed over decades. One is the wildlife misidentification. Some skeptics suggest that deer, bears, or other large animals could appear humanoid in low light, especially when seen from a moving vehicle or through dense tree cover. Shadows, uneven terrain, and the mind's tendency to impose familiar forms on ambiguous shapes may explain many sightings. However, this fails to account for the reported upright posture, pacing behavior, and interaction with observers that multiple independent witnesses describe. 2. Pranksters and staged encounters. During the 1970s and 1980s, teenagers would dare one another to drive down isolated roads late at night. Some suggested the Goatman legend grew in part of staged pranks, knocking on car doors, hiding in brush, or making noises to scare unsuspecting visitors. Yet even after the internet era began, and more reports came from adults walking dogs or hiking alone, the behavior patterns remain eerily consistent, with no obvious human presence responsible. Third, folklore reinforcement and expectation. Psychologists and folklorists point out that legends shape perception. Knowing the story could make observers more alert, more likely to notice ambiguous movements, and more likely to interpret shadows or sounds as confirmation. While this explains some reports, it does not fully explain consistent behavioral interactions, such as footsteps that stop when a witness stops or objects arranged deliberately in the woods. 4. Research facility myth. A persistent local rumor links the Goatman to experimental work allegedly conducted at the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center. Some speculate that genetic experiments or animal-human hybrid testing could have escaped into the surrounding woods. Official records, however, confirm no such experiments were conducted. The story remains a speculative explanation, possibly fueled by the eerie combination of science and rural isolation in local imagination. None of these explanations fully account for the behavioral consistency described across decades, the rhythmic knocking, the pacing alongside vehicles, and the silent observation that many witnesses report all point to something that interacts with human in a deliberate pattern way. Yet none of these theories confirm anything beyond folklore or urban legend. No photograph has ever clearly captured the entity. No video has documented it beyond shadowy movement. No law enforcement record has verified its existence. The Goatman remains, for now, a record of presence. And the patterns continue, the knocks continue, the footsteps continue. The sense of being watched continues, a phenomenon neither fully explained nor fully understood. It is a legend rooted in place, behavior, and repeated experience, and it endures quietly along the wooded roads of Prince George's County. The bridge remains. Decades have passed, yet Crybaby Bridge still spans the narrow creek. Its wooden planks creak under tires. Cars pass over it, headlights cutting through the early morning mist or late night darkness. The surrounding woods are no less dense than they were in the 1970s. Shadows still collect in corners where the streetlights fail to reach. The narrow roads twist and bend, hiding dips, small embankments, and stretches of undergrowth that have swallowed countless rumors. Reports of knocking continue to circulate online. Reddit threads, local forums, and community social media pages are filled with recent experiences, new visitors recounting 3 distinct knocks, sometimes followed by a single reply, a beat behind, as if the entity is aware of their presence. No injuries have ever been documented, no disappearances have been confirmed. Officially, the bridge is no more dangerous than any other rural crossing, yet those who stop to look, who linger near the tree line, often report an unshakable sensation they are being watched, not threatened, not attacked, not forced to flee, just observed. The pattern persists. Stop, and the sound stops. Move, and the footsteps or rustling resumes. Visitors describe a weight in the air, a deliberate presence that feels sentient, measured, aware. Some passers-by recall subtle signs, the brush slightly disturbed, the faint snap of a twig, or a shadow shifting just beyond age of vision. The forest holds its breath, and so do those who walk through it. According to nearly every account, the entity does not act without provocation. It does not initiate, it responds, and the legend endures. Crybaby Bridge stands as a silent archive of these encounters, a marker of decades of human experience and folklore, a place where something might still be watching, waiting, testing whether it will be noticed. Status unverified. Yet in the stillness of the woods, in the pause between one knock and the next, the story continues, quietly and unresolved. End of case.